Alright, so we're going to analyze some of the important points in Moore's argument. I can prove now. I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. Right? That two human hands exist. Remember, and now you'll have to follow along with me. This is going to be a rather dense section, and it's not going to be for everybody, obviously. The uber nerds will love this, but I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. I underline and I've bold two human hands. This is going to be the conclusion of the proof. How do we know this, right? Because if we look above, it says, I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist, right? The demonstration of the proof is formulated in such a manner that we will necessarily arrive at the conclusion that two human hands exist. It's absolutely important that, and this might be obvious for more advanced viewers, but it's absolutely important that you recognize that two human hands exist is the conclusion of the proof. Once I've arrived at the proposition, therefore, two human hands exist, I have thus arrived at the conclusion of the proof. Why? Because the whole formulation of the proof is to get me to that point. Right? That's very, very important. Right? So, this is key, right? This is important. This is absolutely critical. Key, the conclusion is that two human hands exist, right? Two human hands. Okay. So the conclusion is that two human hands exist. Okay. So I can prove now, and I'll talk about now in a little bit why that's important, for instance, that two human hands exist. It's very important to stop there. Just a quick side note, I had a friend on Facebook message me, PM me the other day and said, hey, Dr. Campbell, I read really slow, philosophy, blah, 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 I'm having difficulty in my education. And I told him, I was like, nobody reads slower than me. In preparing for this lecture last night, the day before the upload of this video, I read this section, it's like 3 pages, 3-4 pages, but I read it twice before I began constructing the notes, so that I get a sense of what it was. The preparation for this lecture, 4 pages probably took me about maybe 5 hours, right? Because it's so dense. There are points that you would miss. For example, the fact that the conclusion is the demonstration of proof for two human hands existing, right? You might not recognize that, but it's absolutely critical in understanding what Moore is doing, right? So, that is the conclusion. How? By holding up my... Now, this is an assumption. Moore doesn't say this. He could have, this is not a critique of Moore, but Moore doesn't say this. But obviously, there's a missing connective, right? The connection would be that G.E. Moore is a human being, and therefore, as a human being, at least, and it would get more rigorous because not all human beings have hands, right? But there is a built-in assumption here that when he says "my," right? By holding up my two hands, that he in fact is a human being, and that some human beings have hands, right? That's the built-in assumption. So the term "my" is important. Why? Because "my" contains within it the assumption that he is therefore a human being. The conclusion is that humans have two hands, right? That two hands, not humans have two hands, but that two human hands exist, right? My assumes Moore is a human. I could really complicate this analysis more, right? And it would be interesting for budding epistemologists to complicate this more, simply for the fact that non-human animals have hands as well. Primates obviously have hands, right? So it's a very specific, and this is Moore's genius, right? It's a very specific type of proof. Though he doesn't complicate it more than it needs to be complicated, it's important that you recognize the built-in assumption in the word "my." "My" in this demonstrative proof, right, in what he says he's doing, in this act, in this performative demonstration, my assumes and has built into it, the word my, the assumption that he is human and that the gestures that he makes with his hands demonstrates the condition for the proof, right? So very important. So you need to be able to identify the assumption in there, okay, fine, two hands, and saying, as I make a certain gesture with my right hand, right, as I make a certain gesture with my right hand, here is one. Now, I think probably one of the most difficult things to identify in Moore's in his argument is the proof and is not the proof, is the premise and the conclusion, right? It's important to recognize that the premise is his act of saying, and here is my right hand, and here is my left hand. So here's a right hand, and here's a left hand, and I have thus arrived at the conclusion via the gesticulation of my body that two human hands exist. So that my premise is the demonstrative act of showing here, now, we'll get to now in a second, right? Here, now is a right hand, here now is a left hand. Okay, so here now is a right hand is the premise, right? The conclusion thus being, which we arrive at almost immediately via a few assumptions, is that two human hands exist. Okay, so our premise, and this is also is important, right? This is also critical. The premise is a certain gesture, and then here is one hand. Here is one hand. Right? A certain gesture and saying here is one hand. A certain gesture, here's one hand, a certain gesture, and here's another hand. I arrive at the, as premise, I arrive at the conclusion that two human hands exist. And adding as I make a certain gesture with the left, and here is another. Okay, the last thing that we need to address is now, right? The idea of temporality, right? We have an argument which is itself contingent on a present state of affairs. Now, I'm not going to complicate this too much because it would take us way, sort of into the murky waters in terms of modality and sort of epistemological modal understanding of our knowledge, sort of self-reflectively. But in terms of now, it's important to recognize that for Moore to construct, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because it gets too complicated, but he does talk about this briefly. For Moore to offer a performative demonstration, we have to recognize that there was a time in which he conceptualized the performative demonstration, right? That time prior to the performative demonstration represents a future with a little f, right? Now I'm not going to get into all of that, but I am going to, in 5 seconds, do as Moore did and give you a performative demonstration of the existence of my right hand. 5, 4, 3, 2, here is my right hand, right? Obviously, I conceptualized that before I actually did it, and I recognized that my conceptualization facilitated the action, but prior to me actually showing it, that represented a future point, right? He does it at time t. Here's my right hand, which now has passed, so that we have a very linear, this is as simple as I can make it, we have a very linear understanding that insofar as I perform it, I satisfy conditions for the past, I satisfy conditions for the present, and in the conceptualization of my demonstration, I've anticipated or posited, I've posited a future existence, right? You can't satisfy conditions for the future, that's impossible, right? What I've done is I've posited the conditions for demonstration in the future. This is very, very important. I'll say that one more time, right? I've posited